Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual View, and today we're going to be reviewing The Analysis of the Self by Heinz Kohut. So this book is very interesting in many regards, as it's going to delve into the treatment of narcissistic personality disorder, and Kohut, being one of the pioneers in the treatment of such disorder, it's very interesting to read what he has to say. And for him, it's going to be very interesting because he's going to go back to metapsychology, i.e. the understanding of the mind itself. And for him, narcissistic individuals are below what he calls the endopsychic structure. Nothing to do with Fernburn. He's using it in a different way. For him, the endopsychic structure is the ego, superego, and id, i.e. Freudian 101 theory. Okay? So for him, that Freudian theory does not apply to narcissists. What does apply, though, is dual positioning between an idealized internal parental imago, i.e. an image of the parents that's idealized within the narcissist, and the grandiose self. So we're going to start by explaining what is the internalized, idealized internal parental imago. It's a lot of words. Well, basically, the idealized imago is this fundamental belief that there is, at the very start of life, and for Kohut this is the most important phase, a merger between the individual and their caregiver. A merger that is so strong that the narcissism, i.e. the self-esteem of each, is merged and infused together. So basically, the fundamental oneness gives to the individuals that unite a sense of power, a sense of belonging, and a sense of love and oneness. However, that oneness and that sense of exceptionality normally is renounced slowly and gradually. But in the case of the narcissist, what happens, according to Kohut, is that there is a drastic cutting off point. It's no longer a slow and progressive renouncement, it's a cut. That cut is not going to allow the infant to disidealize, i.e. to renounce idealization, to tone it down slowly but surely. It's going to fall very deeply, very quickly. So what's going to happen is that the infant is going to, in response to that fall, put on all the energy he had invested in the merger back into himself, which is going to create a grandiose self. So how both manifest is that the ideal internal parent, Imago, is going to be like a fused state where, we're both together, we're both exceptional, we are wonderful, we can make the world bend if we are together, we are exceptional because we're together, and I am exceptional by associating with you, right? In the second case, the grandiose self is, I need no one, I am self-reliant, I am all-powerful, I do not need others. Others need me, but I am better than them, and I don't need them, right? So this is the two fundamental positions. A bit caricatured what I did, but it's for you to get the idea, right? So these two positions fundamentally are below ego, superego, and id. And the whole aim of psychotherapy for narcissists is to help them develop a superego. And you might say, wait a minute, if they have an ideal, if they have an idealized parental imago within them, don't they have high standards? Well, not for Kohut, because for Kohut what is happening there is that there is a merger with the ideals of someone else. But it's not moral standards, it's not what is right and what is wrong. It is more about what brings glory, contentment, and absolute satisfaction, rather than what is good or morally right, let's say. So in this case, there is no superego per se for Kohut. What there is something else, something that's going to seek admiration, be it as the grandiose self or the internalized, idealized parental imago. So here it's a different dynamic altogether. But the aim is to try and develop that superego. And very interestingly enough, for Kohut, narcissists can absolutely develop through psychoanalysis and through psychotherapy on the whole. Whereas he's much more skeptical and much more nuanced about the prognosis of borderline and schizoid patients. As he explains in the book, he feels that these types of psychopathologies are closer to psychosis, therefore, they're not capable of joining the so-called classic Freudian ego and superego structure, whereas the narcissist can bridge it. So it's very interesting because often in training we are taught that narcissists are among the hardest patients to have, and that they are much more complex or complicated or difficult, should I say, to help. Whereas he's saying that no, they are much more helpable, or they can develop much more easily than borderline and schizoid. So very interesting because it's, in my opinion, very counterintuitive as an opinion, but it's his opinion and I'm trying to basically share it with you. So how does the therapist help the narcissist develop? Well, for Kohut, it is a very long process. We're not talking about weeks, we're not talking about months, we're talking about years. And for him, there are three main types of transference that the patient is going to basically develop on the analyst. I'm going to go in order of gravity. The first is the merger transference. So this is the most massive in terms of defenses, in terms of feelings and affects. So in this phase, the patient will not tolerate any difference between themselves and the analyst. They won't tolerate any mistakes, any errors, anything really that comes and hurts the ideal. So basically, they might be prone to rages if the therapist is late, if he misunderstands, if he doesn't remember, if he's been basically opaque, or if the patient feels that they're not understanding the therapist. The aim here is to dominate the therapist because any difference is far too scary. Therefore, there needs to be a complete merger, i.e. there's absolutely zero differences between patient and analyst. And in these phases, they can be often very attackful, very persecuted, because there's so much anxiety bind to it. The second phase, that has two names, alter ego transference or twin chip transference. I prefer twin chip, so I'm going to go for that. Twin chip transference is this idea that there's already a little gap that's created in which the patient kind of knows that the analyst is not him, but they might think that the analyst is completely linked up with them. Like, for example, they might say things like, "Oh, I know you get me," or "I'm sure you agree with me. I'm 100% sure that we share the same opinion on this particular issue." Here, there is somewhat a form of separation, but it's still very fragile. It's still not quite there yet, but it's better than merger, but it's not quite at mirror transference. Because mirror transference for Kohut is the best form of transference that the narcissist can achieve. In this stage, basically the object, i.e. the therapist, the other, is separate. But it is expected, the patient expects of the therapist to shower them with praise, with love, with understanding, with sympathy, and so on and so forth. And the idea here for the patient is basically to re-experience the first ever relationship with mother, i.e. or with the caretaker, i.e. that unconditional positive regard, as Rogers called it. Kohut doesn't really talk like that, but you get the idea. The fundamental idea for Kohut is through this phase is to reunite the fragmentation that has happened, i.e. the split part of the personality of the narcissist can be reunited by a mirror image on the analyst of themselves, i.e. what happens is that in a way the analyst reunites the vision of the patient and gives it back to them in a positive regard. So basically what that means is that from bits and pieces of the personality of the narcissist, They're going to be merged together, those bits and pieces, and then given back so that the person can have a complete and better picture of themselves. And fundamentally, if this lasts long enough, they will develop to the point where they will reach what Kohut calls transmutation. So transmutation is when we go from the grandiose self slash ideal parental Imago to an ego, superego, and id structure of the mind. And that transmutation is this step that's happening. And I'm saying a step, but it's not one big event, it's not one major event, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions between analyst and patient, interpretations, the setting, so many things come in play in this. But the idea is we go from something that basically excludes any form of separateness, any form of this idealization, to a structure of the mind that tolerates it. And fundamentally for Kohut, it is a very slow process. He even says that at the very beginning, often narcissists will come forward with very little sins that might seem very minute to the outside observer or even to a therapist. But he says it's very, very, very important to not dismiss those very small steps, because for the patient, for the narcissistic patient, they put themselves in a very high position of vulnerability, of something that's very, very, very hard for them to talk about, hard for them to share. Therefore, when they're sharing it, it is very important to welcome it, to even basically almost to congratulate them on being able to talk about it, because it's not easy for them, even though it might not seem that bad. But it's a very important step for them to be able to trust a therapist in order to grow. Because what's going to be very important is the alliance, the psychotherapeutic alliance, the transference, and also the countertransference. So for Kohut, even though he does not, I think, go to the full extent of what we now use as countertransference, he does talk about it, saying that the analyst might be mildly annoyed, bored, and he says that all of these things are normal, and that, very interestingly enough, for him it's very important for the analyst to be able to tolerate the idealization of the patient, at least in the beginning, because the patient needs to be able to project his ideal onto the therapist, and the therapist must be willing to accept it. And he says that a lot of the time the therapist is prone to reject it and say, I'm not this, or to interpret it's a projection, you're projecting onto me what you would have wanted your parents to be like, and so on and so forth. He says that that's a mistake, because by doing so, what's happening is that there's a breakdown of the ideal, and therefore what's happening is that the patient's going to be entrenched into his grandiose sense of self, because the therapist can't take it in. So the therapist has to tolerate it, even though it might be uncomfortable. And of course that doesn't mean that it's always going to be the case, but the tolerance of it is going to help the patient to project and then create a mirror transference. Once you're in the mirror transference, separativeness or separation can run its course, but at its own pace. But if you refuse the projection in the first place, you're no longer a mirror. You're just becoming someone that rejects the patient, rejects how the patient functions. Therefore, very important to tolerate a sense of grandiosity and the fact of the patient seeing someone grandiose in the therapist. So very, very interesting stuff. And he also says that it's not uncommon to be bored or to be annoyed, especially if this pseudologia fantastica, i.e. pathological line. And he says that the aim when this pathological line is for it to slowly build up and to becoming almost like a joke, a half lie, half joke situation. And it's very important for the analyst not to show annoyance at this, or not to try and interpret the lie directly, rather to tolerate the lie as one tolerates the grandiosity that the patient sees within the therapist. So it's very, very important for him to do so, because that's going to create the favorable conditions for the evolution, the transmutation of the patient and of the patient's psyche. And also for him, he has a whole theory of the genesis, the psychogenesis of narcissism. For him, narcissism is basically arrested development. That at the very beginning of life, being in the grandiose self and the ideal imago, parental imago, those two positions are completely normal. However, normally, what happens is the environment is good enough to be able to help the child slowly disinvest, slowly renounce those idealistic and perfect and omnipotent pictures and help them develop a more realistic sense of self and of others. However, because of failures in the relationship, and Kohut does not say that it is inherently someone's fault, but what he's saying is the environment was not capable of basically helping the infant slowly renounce all perfection or almightiness. Therefore, the child stays stuck, and staying stuck means that basically they have remained at the development phase in which they remain perfect in order to not lose themselves. Because perfection, grandiosity is a defense mechanism against a complete dissolution of their personality. Because what you have to understand is for Kohut, we start our lives as merged with the other being, and it's only at the cost of separatedness that we can finally develop. But that separatedness is not a given. And basically, there is a lot of fear that once you separate, all your psychic life will be destroyed in the separation. Therefore, it's something that has to be eased throughout time and throughout the repetition of events. That's also a very important point for him, for Kohut. Narcissism is not linked to one event. It's not one big trauma that occurred and the child was a narcissist. No, for him it's hundreds and hundreds of interactions, failed interactions, broken down of interactions with parents, with families, with communities that lead a child to that path. So it's a very complex way of seeing things. It's absolutely not an easy, this happened, therefore this and that, and the personality become that. Absolutely not. No, it's a myriad of circumstances that came in together to shape the personality of the individual. So for him, the whole end of the therapy with narcissistic people is to develop a superego, but also to help them sublimate, i.e. create artistic and scientific products. And maybe, if it's possible, also develop a sense of wisdom. So for him, all of that is basically built upon the good relationship with the therapist and the analysis, not brutal, but when it comes apronomie, as we would say in French, i.e. at the perfect time in which basically the patient can take it in. So one has to be very careful with interpretations of narcissists because they might not be ready to listen to all of what we have to say. Therefore, it has to be measured. It's slowly but surely, and every time it's a step further. So it's every little step counts. And even if there is regression, and for Kohut he does talk about regression, notably in the sense of perversions, i.e. people go back to certain fetishes or even to substance abuse. And he says that that's part of the course. Like, for example, if the analyst is on vacation, there might be regression because the analyst is no longer there. But it's not because there is regression that wrecks all the work that has been achieved. It's just like there's a bit of regression, then you go on, and then it comes back. So the analyst and the patient both have to be very patient about analysis. It's not a quick process, but it's a very, very important one in order for the narcissist to be able to grow out of his narcissistic behavior and acquire a more psychically stable framework, should I say. I should also add that Kohut is not an idealist because he does say that there will always be a bit of the grandiose self or idealized parental imago in the individual. It's not like once it's done, it's gone forever. No, it's always something that needs to be worked on, to be thought about. But there is a betterment, and that betterment, I can only agree with him, is possible. If ever an analyst analyzes slowly but surely with the patient, as long as the patient is confident in the analyst, and the analyst can give them positive regard, especially nowadays in which narcissism has been completely demonized. I think that Kohut was a really, strangely enough, a bit of fresh air in this environment in which we are very quickly prone to see them as monsters. Kohut does not see them like that. And he shows us that there is an alternative, and that alternative is seeing them as humans that have been hurt, and helping them get out of the hurt. So fundamentally, I hope you like this review. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them by in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.